The CTF is nonpartisan and opposes tax and policy changes to any government in Canada, regardless of political stripe. So, she's not always picking on the Trudeau and the Liberals. So, and with the current federal and provincial governments affecting us directly, the CTF has many high income taxes, carbon taxes, empty home tax, speculation tax, school property tax surcharge, and the new employer health tax. And I'm sure there's more. That was just in my head today from my clients. So, and unfortunately, most of these taxes have been brought in to appease the voting base of the current governments rather than based on facts. And the CTF is not afraid to challenge these taxes. Chris's bio in the Rotor gives a great summary of how she came out of Hope, BC to become a leading spokesperson for the rights of Canadian taxpayers. And Chris's talk today will be on including the BC and federal carbon taxes. Hopefully Chris will have some time for questions, because I'm sure there will be lots. Anyway, Chris?
Thank you. Thank you very much. There, can everybody hear me? Mm-hmm. Lovely. First off, thank you so much for having me here. It is always humbling to be around so many people who give so generously of both their money and their time, and seeing things like the charity that is being shown now to young people who are just exiting foster care is amazing. And so thank you all for all that you do. It's groups like this that actually make living in Canada a little bit easier. A little bit of biography for me. I, as was mentioned, from Hope originally, but I lived and worked mostly in Ottawa for the past 17 years or so, a little stint in Nova Scotia. Most of that time I spent being a journalist, and so I worked and covered things on Parliament Hill, and when I wasn't doing that, I was covering a lot of court. And I bring that up because it's at places like court, including youth court, where you see what happens when young people especially don't have supports and they don't have hands up like what we just saw. So that's very touching, and I just wanted to personally congratulate you all for taking on issues like that. They really make a difference. As far as the CTF, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, goes, for those of you who don't know, we're almost 30 years old. We started as a prairie protest group against the GST when it was first introduced. A lot of you might remember back in the early 1990s where there was this real pushback of people feeling they were tapped out. They were maxed out. They were being overtaxed, and they were angry and didn't want to take it anymore. And that's how a lot of ratepayer groups start. They can either start locally or provincially, but in our case, it started provincially between Alberta and Saskatchewan, and those two ratepayer groups joined forces, and they stayed together. Usually with ratepayer groups, they have a shelf life of about 5 years. Somebody gets up in arms, they start organizing, they push back against something, they quite often achieve their goal, and then things die down. With the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, unfortunately, because there are so many different levels of government and so many demands of taxation that are seemingly ever increasing, we actually stuck around. And so now we have directors from here in British Columbia all the way across to the Atlantic provinces, and we have a special director that keeps an eye on just the federal government. As was mentioned, we're not-for-profit, we're nonpartisan. We don't care if it's the blue team or the red team or the orange team. If you're wasting money and you're not being accountable, we'll come after you. What I really love about the CTF is that even though we're dealing with issues that can often be negative, or they can get you depressed, or they can get you down, we try to have a bit of joy with it. We know that these issues can be taxing, no pun intended. Sorry, mom joke. So we try to have joy with it. So for example, we're the ones that hand out what's called the Teddy Awards. And so every year we have this big awards gala in Ottawa, and we hand out waist awards, and everybody wears tucks and tails and evening gowns and the whole bit. And we joke and make fun, and we hand out a waster award. So for example, this year, there might be some candidates that are running in Victoria. If anybody's been paying attention to the speaker's reports on the allegations of taxpayer dollars being wasted there. And so we do things like that. What we also do is we try to be the watchdog for new and emerging taxes. We're not against all taxes. We're against tax dollars being wasted. We're also against it, especially when it starts eating into people's personal choices and personal freedoms. And so that's why I wanted to give you an example today of the BC carbon tax. As many of you have probably seen, if you're following federal politics, the federal government is trying to put through a federal carbon tax, including on the provincial jurisdictions who have said they don't want it. So for example, the province of Saskatchewan and very recently the province of Ontario. Through their provincial election, they said quite clearly that they don't want a provincial carbon tax. Well, now the feds are saying they're going to get one anyway. Our supporters, and we have more than 150,000 of them now across Canada, many of them are donors. We're a donor-based organization, that's how we function. Many of our supporters feel so strongly about things like the carbon tax that they encourage us to even become interveners. And what that means is so for example, the province of Saskatchewan is arguing with the federal government in court saying we don't want a carbon tax. So in this case, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation says, okay, we're going to send our lawyer in there too. We will team up with Premier Scott Moe. You can tag us in when you need to, and we'll be an intervener on your behalf, on taxpayers' behalf in the province of Saskatchewan. We're doing a very similar thing with the court challenge that's happening right now in Ontario. And the reason why I wanted to raise this issue here is because, of course, here in British Columbia, we've had a carbon tax now for many years. I'm raising it as an issue and a concern because the federal government is using British Columbia as an example, as a gold standard of a carbon tax that works. We were concerned from the outset when the BC carbon tax was brought in that it wouldn't stay revenue neutral, that it wouldn't reduce overall CO2 emissions, and that it would take money out of people's pockets. We also doubted the promise that was made more so in Alberta that carbon tax would provide a social license to get our resources out to market, in this case, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, things like that. Fast forward to today, here in British Columbia, we were told when the BC carbon tax was first put in that it would never go more than $30 a ton, that it would always be revenue neutral, that it would reduce CO2 emissions, and in some way, the money would go directly into green tech, and it would make green technology abundant, plentiful, and affordable for all. None of that is true. We now have a carbon tax that is $35 a ton, going up to $40 a ton at the end of this month, starting on April 1st. CO2 emissions, based on the government's own numbers, you can go to their website, CO2 emissions in British Columbia have gone up. That is with the highest carbon tax in all of Canada. The money goes into general revenue. It does not go in directly to green tech. It is no longer even revenue neutral by name, and it has certainly not given a social license to get things like our natural resources out to market. Unfortunately, this is what we were worried about. We were worried that this would happen, and it would simply become another revenue stream, because the moment you allow government to grow, they naturally need revenue. They need to pay for the administration of that tax. They need to pay for the new people who are working within that tax. And then they get connected and dependent upon that tax revenue, and they learn that they need it all the time. And it only ever expands. And our concern here is, for example, our friends at the Fraser Institute, the researchers there, say that we spend around 40% now of our incomes on various levels of taxation. And for many everyday people, that's just too much. They don't have any more to give. And now, especially with things like the cost of housing here in British Columbia, especially in the Lower Mainland, the cost of gasoline, the cost of auto insurance, we have the highest auto insurance in all of Canada. A lot of British Columbian supporters are calling me every week saying, I have no more money to give. And so that is why we're always trying to speak up and saying, excuse me, government, we know that your intentions are often purported to be good, and we know that you say you need this money, but you need to prove to us exactly why. And you also need to keep your promise. And so, for example, the British Columbia carbon tax, it isn't what it was billed as. Now it simply goes into general revenue. Now, if I can give you briefly a quick example to even show you how it wasn't revenue neutral. When it was first introduced as revenue neutral, there was a coinciding income tax cut. But that was only the case for the first little while. Under even the previous government, I'm not trying to pick on the NDP, even under the previous government, they called it revenue neutral. Here's how they did that. So if you go into the budget document, the previous budget documents, you will see revenue neutral BC carbon tax. It's a certain amount, say, for argument's sake, $1.2 billion in 1 year. They put it in a frame. Then they took random tax credits, everything from the children's fitness tax credit to the Vancouver film tax credit to converting school property to 50% farm level. That's a real thing, tax credit. All this stuff that you'd see in any other jurisdiction's budget. Doesn't matter if it's Alberta, Saskatchewan, municipal, you see these sorts of tax credits everywhere without carbon taxes. But they took them and stuck them inside the carbon tax box and made it balance out to zero. I could not understand why this was. It was my first time covering the BC budget. I was used to the federal budget. So I approached the Department of Finance, the bureaucrats there who know what they're doing. And I said, why is this stuck in here? And he said, oh, that's so it balances out to zero. And I said, why? He said, well, we need to make it look revenue neutral. This has only ever been an accounting exercise. This has only ever been an accounting exercise. Unfortunately, all it is a revenue stream. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to provide a little bit of education, a little bit of insight, and to allow people to push back. And even with something more local, here in Vancouver, for example, some of you might remember around this time last year, where the Metro Vancouver board tried to vote themselves a leaving bonus and a retroactive retirement raise. Yeah, it was around $15,000 per person. Sorry if anybody here attending was a member of that board. But to keep in mind, these are actual mayors and actual city councilors who are already being paid for their regular job, either as mayor or a council. They were also being paid every time they attended a meeting. So if the meeting was under 4 hours, they were paid $400. If the meeting went over 4 hours, they were paid close to $800 every time. And this is just a secondary panel. You're literally sitting there talking about surface water and dealing with sewage, maybe once a month. They voted themselves a retirement bonus from this. All of it, your money. And they did it on a Friday afternoon before a long weekend for spring break, for kids' March break. The only reason that we heard about this is because we got a tip. There were no reporters there because newsrooms have been decimated. There's almost no local reporters anymore. I got a phone call that day and said, this just happened. Check it out. And it did happen. And when we raised the alarm to the media, people pushed back. They called up from all political stripes and said, this is not okay. And guess what? They backed down. 5 weeks later, they completely reversed themselves. This was all a big misunderstanding. We shouldn't have done this. Voila. And so that is really what our advocacy organization tries to focus on. We try to shed light. We try to hold politicians accountable. And we try to empower people, again, so they don't get down. We try to empower people to push back and to try to speak up for themselves. And lastly, I just wanted to leave you very quickly. I'm not sure how much time I have left. Lots? Okay, wonderful. Excuse me. Apart from the carbon tax, one of the big issues that we're fighting now here in British Columbia is something called the employer health tax. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this, but the employer health tax affects any job creator with a payroll of more than $500,000. It then goes up based on a notched rate. You'd have to take a look at the finance department to show exactly what the percentage is, anything over and above $500,000. The catch is that it also applies to municipalities. So it doesn't matter if, say, you're a business, the municipality is also paying that employer health tax. Where do municipalities get money? Property taxes. And so by default, Victoria has downloaded a big chunk of healthcare funding onto the backs of property taxpayers in British Columbia. And they're hoping that nobody's going to kick up a fuss about it. It's literally my job to kick up a fuss. So to give you an example, we have a lovely person up in Prince George who has a Main Street business. She's had this business now there for 30 years. She was already kind enough to have been paying the MSP, the medical services premium, for her employees. It's now at 50%, but it's still there. They're double dipping on a healthcare tax. So she's paying the MSP. She's now paying the employer health tax. She's also facing a property tax hike because the city of Prince George is getting this tax on her business. And she's facing a property tax hike on her home. So 4 different ways this person is paying this tax. Why? Because she's one of the cornerstone employers in Prince George. It's really unfair. And I wanted to raise it with this group because there's something she told me that really struck me. She said, you know, I really try to help my employees. I'm a long-term business person here, and I'm really visible. She's right on their main street. It's a big corner business. And she said, I'm so stretched now because I'm getting this triple tax load heaped on top of me this year that when the Boys and Girls Club come to me now, when the parade groups come to me now, when the local hockey team comes to me now, I don't have any more money to give them. And it pains her because she's one of those big flagship local businesses that everybody has learned to depend on, that they'll always be there. And I raise this to point out that there's always a human side. It's easy to get bogged down in numbers when you start thinking of taxation. But taxation and money only ever come from people, whether they're employers, employees, government, you name it. It always has to come from somewhere. And if they start trying to take money out of one end of the bathtub, saying we're just going to hit businesses, that's not true. The water level always goes down, no matter what side you're scooping it out of. And so that is why we try to keep an eye on things like spending, and that is why we're always imploring every level of government to do more with less, or to even see if they need to do what they're doing. Always do a line by line and figure out, does this money need to be spent? Does it need to be spent right now? Could this be done in a different way? Could it be done in a more affordable manner? And am I being accountable? And to leave you with something that's one of those things that comes out of left field, this is what we try to specialize in, is accountability. We mentioned we want lower taxes, smaller government, and more accountability. I'm going to leave you with the example of the BC legislature. Some of you may not have been following this, but the Speaker of the BC legislature has been releasing reports that are astounding. He's releasing reports alleging that legislature officers, including the clerk and the sergeant at arms, have been taking lots of trips and making a lot of expenditures, and a lot of it is all taxpayers' money. I also wanted to point out, a lot of people don't know this, the clerk of the BC legislature's role, like that position's salary, is $347,000 a year. That is the same salary as the Prime Minister of Canada. The BC legislature clerk makes the same amount of money as the Prime Minister of Canada. And I'll tell you right now, if the Prime Minister of Canada spends a nickel of your money, that receipt is posted on the internet. You can look at it. Up until now, shockingly, none of these receipts are posted on the internet. For some reason, nobody thought of it. The MLAs all have to be accountable, no matter what party. They need to say where they're spending their money. They need to post the receipts. But for some reason, those little folks in the middle of the legislature wearing the black and white robes and the silly hats didn't have to post their expenses, ever. And further, even if we'd gotten a tip, or if you had gotten a tip, or a journalist had gotten a tip, they couldn't have picked up the phone and asked, because up until just last week, they were not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. They were just cruising through in the dark, completely under the radar. And the amount of money that's being alleged to have misspent there is gross. Because every time you see them spending money like $3,000 for a wood splitter and $10,000 for a trailer to pull it around in, or multi-$1,000s on yet another trip to the UK, or $1,000 on a suitcase in Hong Kong, we think of where that money could otherwise be spent, on things like this, on charity, or putting it back into your own personal savings. And so that is why we encourage everybody from all political stripes to always try to be aware of what your elected and unelected officials are doing. And if you see wrongdoing, then it's your right to speak up and push back. And so we have an entire resource right on our webpage that helps people write a good letter, how to make a good phone call, to do so respectfully, and to try to get the answers as best they can. So I really appreciate all of your time, and I truly appreciate what it is groups like yours are doing right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris, for sharing all that valuable information with us. Before we go to Q&A, I'd like to invite Thomas Miller up for a minute. As we do each week for our speakers, the way we thank our speakers is to make a donation on behalf of our club and the speaker to the polio campaign to end polio. As everybody knows, the project is slowly nearing its completion, and we make a donation on your behalf, Chris, for the polio campaign to immunize 250 children against the wild polio virus.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
And of course, there's another way to raise money, and that's by supporting our Rotaractors event coming up. And Thomas is here to tell you about that. And while you're listening, get your question ready for Chris.
Hopefully you guys aren't taxed out. I've got $25 to get out of you. We're having an End Polio fundraiser on Tuesday, March the 12th. That's a week from tonight at the Red Truck Brewery. That's on East First near Science World. We're going to have a trivia night, and thanks to the Red Truck Brewery, they provided a burger and beer and the venue at no cost to us. So all $25 for your ticket goes right to ending polio. So please come and see me after. I'll have my email circulated so that you can contact me if you have questions, or find us on Facebook or online as well. If you would like to buy a ticket, please contact me. Please come see me afterwards. Again, it's a trivia night, burger, beer, $25, and we're all going to end polio. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Thomas. I know a Rotarian who lives right across the street. I'm sure he'll be happy to donate and attend the event. Now for some Q&A with Chris.
Thank you.
Okay, first question. The question is not really directly on the topic, but something that you mentioned, that it's decimation of the press. We also consciously rely on the press to make us aware of issues. I wonder if you would elaborate a little on what has happened to press coverage, say, over the last half dozen years,
Yes.
particularly in this area.
Thank you. So taking off my CTF hat and putting on my much more worn hat as being a journalist. Bit of background, I've worked in television, radio, massive newspaper, chain print, you name it. And I graduated from BCIT here back in 1998 or whatever. I have seen a shocking decline in newsrooms. I'll put it this way, they're almost empty. They started out full. You'd have beat reporters that covered things like City Hall all the time. That was their only job. Or covered courts all the time. That was their only job. Traffic, weather, all these things. Now, I would say, just from my own experience and eyeballing it, there's been, where there used to be 10, there are now 2 or 3 people left in that room. And so what that means, to your point, when you have fewer and fewer journalists, that means that you literally have fewer and fewer sets of eyes and ears out there covering things, that are boring. Things like a regional district meeting where you're sitting there listening for hours and hours about, water fees and taxation levels. But it was always that reporter's job to sit there and listen and to write it up for their local paper, who they're then read by all sorts of people, including people in this room, business leaders, Rotary groups, you name it, who can then take action and be aware. And so if you're not getting local coverage like that anymore, you're really living in an information vacuum. And it's a smaller example with the issue of the Metro Vancouver board that I gave you. But just imagine what that's like on a bigger level. So the only reason we even heard about it is because somebody there had a conscience, who was a staffer, I don't know who it was, phoned me on a random Friday afternoon to say this happened. And I called all of my friends in the press. I actually went to school with some of them here because I was a trained journalist here. I said, was anybody there? And they said, no, we don't have anybody to cover this. And that's just the sad reality. And when I get to, say, a provincial level, you'd be surprised at how few reporters there are sitting over there in Victoria at the legislature. And to give you an example, and it's a sad one, if you take up a look in the legislature, any building, there's an entire row for the press gallery. There's actually 3 rows of seats that span the entire end of the press gallery. Same thing goes in Ottawa. They used to be full, and now there's a couple people sitting there, if you're lucky. And so this is the problem when you have journalism from all walks of life. If they're slightly right wing or slightly left wing or straight down the middle or publicly funded or private, that isn't what I'm talking about. It's the manpower and the people on the ground. And if you have fewer and fewer, you're going to get less and less information. And you're going to get less information like what I just talked to you about. And so it's a major, major problem.
We got more questions
So
for you,
go right
Chris.
ahead.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, how does your organization pressure governments to either cut back or to cancel wasteful government programs?
So great question. We do it through a variety of ways. I will hold a press conference. I go to the budget lockup, for example. I'm one of the many stakeholders that is sitting there. So I will sit there. There'll be the students of British Columbia, the Vancouver Board of Trade, the Chamber of Commerce, everybody in between. And so I will read through the budget document, and then I will give our taxpayers' perspective to the media. The media then hopefully informs the public, and then the public, if they don't like what they hear, will hopefully pick up the phone and call their MLA. I will also do things with less seriousness and a bit more joy. So for example, trying to get them to open up ICBC to competition to allow you to have a choice for auto insurance, because it was started back in the 1970s and because insurance, talking about it is really boring. I actually have an entire disco suit that I will wear with a perm, and I'll hold my press conferences in front of orange VW vans from the 1970s. And I will point out that this thing was started back in the era of the Pinto and the Gremlin, and isn't it time to update it? And it sounds silly, but it gets a lot of eyeballs because TV likes a spectacle. And it also reminds people that we're all human, maybe we've made a mistake, and it's time to get with the program. So I go through a variety of ways, both serious and a little bit more lighthearted. We also do things like letter writing campaigns. So if it's something that people feel really strongly about, we'll encourage them to start a letter writing campaign. We'll also do petitions. So if we get a big stack of petitions, we'll have a big announcement where we wheel it out on a dolly or a hand truck, and we'll have a huge press conference about it. You also might have seen a few years ago a big inflated balloon that might have looked like a senator in Ottawa. So,
Thank
all
you.
sorts of fun.
Another one.
What is your comment, or if you have any comments, on the underground economy? People saying, you know what, why should I pay any tax? So this guy's gonna take cash for something to do, cash is king kind of thing.
That's a great question. And it just, speaking from my own experience, speaking with people, mostly as a journalist, I find that whenever taxation levels get to a certain height, you start seeing things like that happen more and more often. And then there's no real way to control it. Then you don't know where the money's coming from, where it's going, and then people will get more and more cynical. I've also seen, it's a correlation actually, I've seen arguments in the United States, for example. They'll often say things like, they're more charitable, pound for pound and per capita, because their taxation level is lower. And so if their taxation, what the government is forcibly taking from you to give to something else, they'll often try to say it's to hospitals or schools, and of course never into waste, because they don't like to say that. If they're already taking that much from you, a lot of the thinking goes that you'll feel less charitable, that you won't have the money left over, like literally don't have it left over, like that poor lady up at Prince George, or it starts feeling resentful, and then you give less. So I find that the spirit is quite the same, both the underground economy and less charitable giving. There's a real tipping point there.
Okay, we got a couple more questions.
Yeah, thanks again for a great presentation. I've sat on the board of the BC Freedom of Information Privacy Association for almost a quarter century, and I can say that a lot of times our partnerships with your organization were really, really successful.
Yes.
And our BC group has been called by some of the academic experts as the #1 advocacy group for government accountability in the world, and certainly in Canada.
He's gonna give us a question.
It's okay. I really appreciate the work that you do. No.
Great work.
Thank you.
So I can't help but ask you, you've launched a national petition on curing the SNC Lavalin disease right
Yes.
to the root. How do we do that?
Great question. So a lot of people may not realize this, but this whole thing started back when they changed the criminal code to suit this problem. And they changed the criminal code by putting that bill, that legislation, inside the budget bill. Like the budget bill, which is something that a government can fall or stand on. So it's obviously a confidence vote. Usually the budget bill is about this thick and boring as anything, and you pass it through. It's just a matter of course. But they stuck a change to the justice system, to the criminal code inside of it. That's called omnibus legislation. I don't know if any of you ever watched The Simpsons, But there was that great episode back when they were about to save Springfield and there was a comet coming towards them and they put a rider on it for arts funding and it failed. So that, in a very silly way, that's omnibus legislation. And so we have a petition saying no more omnibus legislation. Because if this would have been brought out of committee and argued about there by elected representatives, maybe we wouldn't be in this pickle that they're in right now with SNC. So that's our angle on it. A lot of us have different opinions on it, but we try to stay within our lane. So our lane is usually things like accountability, smaller government, and lower taxes. We can get into all sorts of arguments about all the other things about SNC in this issue. So we stick to no omnibus legislation.
Got a couple more.
I have to give our Joe here a plug. I'm for over 60 years in business, in the real estate business. I own apartments in Victoria, in White Rock, in Langley. The question is the following. The only time my property taxes went down when Joe was the mayor of the city of Langley.
That was a good question.
We're probably getting on to speculation questions. Yes.
Thank you very much for this talk. I actually have 86 people that I have employed in my business, and so that tax is really hurting us a lot.
Yes.
And we went to the Vancouver Board of Trade and actually talked with Ian Black, and the room was packed, probably twice as many people. But that tax still went through. And so my concern is, yeah, we can write letters and we can fight, but what else can we do? Because I know I'm not the only one affected in this room by that tax.
That's a great question. So
Bill
what we
Vandersand, because he railroaded the last tax.
what we try to do on top, so we go to, like, the stages usually go like this. Letter writing, petition, and then they need to sign on the dotted line. And so, for example, what we've seen in previous governments, we have seen things like, I will scrap the carbon tax. We literally haul a contract out in front of them, and all of the cameras are rolling, and that politician has to sign. John Smith will cut this tax if I am elected. And that's really the one that puts it up over the wall. The catch with the MSP is that the NDP said they were going to get rid of the MSP, which we agreed with publicly. We said that's a very good thing, but they didn't say they were going to replace it with the employer healthcare tax. So it's usually those stages, letter writing, petitions, and then we make them sign it. It's a pledge that they sign before they're elected.
Great. Well, excellent questions and excellent answers. Thank you so much for sharing, Chris.
Thank you.
What a great speaker. Before we finish up, to go right along with tax season, we have an interesting series of speakers, as you've heard lately. And the next one for next week is Dr. Peter German, Queen's Charter and President of the International Center for Criminal Law Reform. And his talk will be on money laundering and the Vancouver model. And with that, I'd like to ask you to all rise for a toast. And the toast is a toast to fair taxes.
What's the definition of fair?
Thanks for coming. Have a great week.
She's like, very